a scarf that didn't belong to the dead, yet lay wrapped around the body. Welcome to Tea and Clue. I'm your host, Elias Thorne. Join the mystery. Drop your location in the comments. I treasure every message you leave. Let's begin. The village of Lillingham, St. Giles, had always prided itself on the singular talent of remaining quite dull. It was not picturesque enough to attract the sort of weekenders who'd make changes, nor modern enough to threaten its own rhythm. It had, in Miss Hartwell's phrasing, a kind of preserved mediocrity, which everyone accepted as either a blessing or a death sentence, depending on whether one had lived there all their life or had only just arrived. It was late September, and the annual autumn charity fete was being held in the churchyard under a marquee that sagged cheerfully in the breeze. Mrs. Draper, who chaired the event every year with the insistence of one who had nothing else to chair, was already perspiring under her fox stole by 10 in the morning. Beside her, Miss Marple was carefully adjusting a plate of seed cake on the Women's Guild table. The old lady's gloves were of soft grey kid, and her pale blue eyes missed nothing, not the extra lump of sugar Nora Penrose took when she thought no one was looking, nor the curious expression that flickered across Cynthia Bloxham's face when the raffle prize was announced to be a silver-backed brush set. At precisely 11:15, Reverend Clemens rang the brass bell to signal the opening of the fete, and within moments, the familiar trappings of village celebration were in full swing. The tombola wheezed into motion, the jam stall did brisk trade, and little Daisy Bennett, crowned Autumn Fairy Queen, skipped about with orange leaves glued to her paper crown. It was 12:30 when the shriek came, shrill, tearing, and from the direction of the vicarage garden. The fete paused, as if the entire village had inhaled sharply and could not let it out again. By the time Miss Marple reached the source of the sound, quite without hurry, but with undeniable purpose, a small knot of people had formed around the wooden bench beneath the old hawthorn tree. Lying slumped there, with one hand flung awkwardly over the backrest and eyes open to nothing in particular, was Martin Weatherby. He was a solicitor from the neighboring town, not quite local but not unfamiliar either, the sort of man who came to Lillingham Street. Giles for committee meetings and impromptu bridge games. His cheeks were unusually flushed for someone so still, and a long silken scarf, crimson with a print of hummingbirds, was knotted tightly around his neck. Dr. Ives arrived breathless and ruddy, called hastily from the tea tent. His examination was swift and grim. "He's dead," he said, and then, with visible discomfort, "been dead for some time. Not a heart attack, not with that scarf. We'll need the police." Mrs. Draper let out a dramatic gasp, though it was well known she disliked Martin Weatherby and had once called him positively sleek. Daisy Bennett began to cry, and her mother hurried her away with the pragmatic speed of a woman determined her child not be associated with unpleasantness. Miss Marple did not cry out or turn away. Instead, she looked carefully at the scarf, at the positioning of the body, and then, quite calmly, down at the crushed petunias by the base of the bench. Her eyes lingered on a faint scuff mark in the soil, and then on a butter-yellow daisy that had caught on the edge of Weatherby's trouser cuff. "Dear me," she murmured, and stepped back to allow the constable to pass. Constable Short, barely 22 and rosy with importance, took charge with the flustered authority of someone who had recently completed a training module on murder, but never expected to use it. He did what he had been taught. He cleared the area, scribbled notes, and directed the arrival of Detective Inspector Graves from the county. Graves was tall, bald, and gave the impression that his mustache was permanently disappointed in everyone it met. He took one look at the scene and began questioning people with a brusque efficiency that satisfied no one and irritated many. The scarf, he learned, did not belong to the deceased, nor had anyone seen Mr. Weatherby arrive that morning. It was Mrs. Penrose's niece who stated that he had been hovering about the jam stall yesterday, and that she thought him a bit funny, you know. not haha funny. There was gossip, of course. He had been romantically linked to at least 2 women in the area. The aforementioned Cynthia Bloxham and quiet, velvet-voiced Dora Wills, who worked part-time in the vicar's office. There were also rumors he had been pressing someone about a will, though no one could quite remember who or what sort of will it was. By the time the fete was officially called off, the tea had grown cold, the seed cake forgotten. The entire village was vibrating with the shared knowledge that something deeply improper had occurred beneath their hawthorn tree. Miss Marple stood beside Mrs. Draper as the police carted the body away and said mildly, "Such a pity about that lovely scarf. It was quite out of place, don't you think?" Mrs. Draper sniffed. "I expect the man brought it himself. Heaven knows he was fond of theatrical touches." Miss Marple smiled. Kindly, distantly. "Oh no, I don't think it was his at all. It didn't suit him in the least. Too playfully cruel." And with that, she adjusted her gloves and went back to the Women's Guild table, where not a single slice of seed cake had been touched since the body was found. By mid-afternoon, the fete grounds had emptied in cautious clusters, leaving behind only the faintest shimmer of uneaten jelly and overturned bunting. The tent poles stood like mute sentinels, sagging slightly in the soft breeze. Yet behind the curtains of neat red brick cottages and tidy lace-draped windows, a kind of hush had fallen over Lillingham Street. Giles, not silence precisely, but the charged quiet of a community listening to itself. At number 9 Heatherbank Lane, Mrs. Penrose and her niece Elaine were already deep into their version of events. Mrs. Penrose, whose opinions were more often stated than invited, was adamant. Strangled in the middle of the fete. "I always said Martin Weatherby had the look of a man who'd come to no good. It's in the eyes, Elaine. Dart about like rats at a wedding." Elaine, who painted watercolors and had recently dyed a lock of her hair lavender, chewed her toast slowly. "He smiled at me yesterday," she offered, "and he asked if I ever drew people. He said he'd like to see how others saw him." "Exactly the sort of thing a scoundrel says before he bludgeons someone or embezzles a pension," Mrs. Penrose declared. "Mark my words, the scarf was symbolic. These theatrical types, they like symbols. He probably brought it himself. Some sort of message." In the center of the village, at the Bloxham residence, Cynthia Bloxham sat at her piano, playing scales with brittle precision. Her sister, Margaret, stood by the window with her arms folded, watching the empty road below as if it might confess something if stared at long enough. "You're unusually quiet," Margaret said at last. Cynthia's hands hovered over the keys. "I'm wondering why someone would strangle a man in broad daylight." "Because they hated him," Margaret replied too quickly. "Yes," Cynthia murmured. "But not just that. You don't use a scarf like that unless you're trying to say something." Margaret turned, her eyes narrowing. "You're not going to be dragged into this, are you? They'll start asking questions. You always like to play the victim when things turn sour." "I haven't done anything," Cynthia said quietly. "And I don't play the victim. I knew Martin. He wasn't kind, Margaret. People pretend not to notice, but he had a way of speaking to you that made you feel slightly stained afterward, as if he knew something you didn't want known." Margaret didn't reply. Her fingers tightened around the curtain hem. "All the same, I'd be careful. Miss Marple is watching." At the corner table of the post office, Dora Wills pressed a trembling hand to her teacup, though the tea had long gone cold. She sat beside the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Clemens, who spoke in the carefully modulated tones of someone used to administering calm in times of disorder. "It's a terrible thing, of course," said Mrs. Clemens, "but perhaps, in the end, it will be good for the village to come together, even if it's over a tragedy. These things test the moral fabric." Dora nodded, though her mouth trembled slightly. "He was in my office on Tuesday," she said, eyes fixed on the rim of her coupe. "Martin, He said he'd found something he was going to act on. He didn't say what, only that it concerned someone we both knew. Mrs. Clemens blinked. Did he mention a name? No, Dora whispered, but he smiled when he said it, like a child who's about to drop a frog into someone's bed. Meanwhile, back at her cottage on Old Mill Lane, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting untouched in her lap. The lamplight flickered across the soft lines of her face, and her eyes, pale and thoughtful, reflected a deeper stillness than the village around her. She had seen, of course, the scarf, its peculiar flamboyance, the oddity of the knot, and more than that, she had seen Cynthia Bloxham's face when the body was discovered. Not fear, not shock, but something closer to nausea. She also remembered the curious hesitation in young Elaine's speech, the slight pause before she mentioned Weatherby's compliment. It had not been a recollection. It had been a decision to disclose. That mattered. And then there was the scarf itself. Miss Marple had, some years ago, been given one rather like it by her cousin Alicia, who had returned from a voyage to Cairo in high spirits and impractical fashion. It was, she recalled, a particular brand, Italian, gaudy, the kind that made a show of a personality rather than a silhouette. Alicia had worn hers only once, then claimed it made her feel like a parrot with ideas. Miss Marple rose and crossed to her writing desk, where she took up a small address book worn soft with age. Her finger moved with purpose. Bloxham, Cynthia. Yes, younger sister, Margaret. Lives in, occupation, none. A pause. Fond of Weatherby. She wrote a small question mark beside the name. Or fearful. The doorbell rang then, a soft ding that barely startled her. And when she opened it, she found Inspector Graves standing beneath her porch lamp, hat in hand. Miss Marple? He said, nodding. I was hoping you'd indulge a few questions. Of course, Inspector, she said mildly. Though I rather think you've come with a few answers you'd like to test, not questions. He smiled faintly, the way men do when they have been caught being predictable. Perhaps. Mind if I come in? She led him to the sitting room, gesturing toward the fire. Would you like tea? No, thank you. I've had 3 today. Everyone offers when there's been a murder. Miss Marple sat. Then I expect you've also had several theories. Most of them, he said dryly, include gypsies, madness, or Russian spies. Miss Marple chuckled. The mind prefers the exotic when the truth is too close to home. Graves leaned forward. Did you know Mr. Weatherby well? Well enough to understand his effect on people. He was clever with his compliments, especially the kind that sound flattering but press upon an insecurity. A very old trick, I believe the French called it la pique douce, the soft jab. Did you witness anything unusual yesterday before the incident? Miss Marple folded her hands. Several things. A scuffle behind the tea tent, very small. 2 shadows, one retreating. I couldn't say who. And Mrs. Draper's earring went missing briefly, but that's likely unrelated. However, yes? The scarf. It didn't suit him. I don't merely mean in color, Inspector, though that too, but in meaning. It was the kind of scarf a woman might give to a man she wanted to embarrass. Graves' eyebrows lifted. Miss Marple continued, and yet it had a certain pride to it. He wouldn't have worn it willingly, but perhaps he brought it with purpose, or perhaps it was brought to him. Graves tapped a finger against his knee. You think he met someone there, and they had it with them? I think, said Miss Marple gently, that someone brought it as part of a punishment, and that they meant for us all to see what kind of man he was. In color. Graves stood thoughtful. And do you believe this is personal or professional? Miss Marple tilted her head. In Lillingham Street. Giles, Inspector. The line between the two is often a hedgerow rather than a wall. As he left, the old lady returned to her fire, her knitting still untouched, her eyes now distant. A scarf that didn't belong. A man who smiled with too many teeth. A village pretending not to have secrets. It was, she thought, just beginning. Inspector Graves returned to the vicarage with a growing sense of irritation. Not with Miss Marple, precisely, though she had the uncanny habit of speaking in riddles that became obvious only days too late, but with the feeling that he had already missed something. It was a persistent itch behind his professionalism, the kind that suggested not oversight, but misdirection. And he didn't care for misdirection, not in a village where nothing supposedly happened. The body had been taken to the county mortuary, and a preliminary report was expected by morning. But Graves knew better than to wait passively for scientific validation. It was not the bruising around Weatherby's neck that would solve this. It would be the hands that left it, the mind that wrapped that scarf with so much precision, and the motive behind that act of controlled violence. Back in her kitchen, Miss Marple poured herself a modest finger of sherry. She rarely indulged in the afternoon, but the air was thick with thought, and thought, she found, liked a bit of warmth. Her mind returned to Dora Wills, the quiet church secretary with soft hands and anxious eyes. Something in her expression yesterday. No, it was this morning, wasn't it? Time had already begun to compress itself. Had struck Miss Marple as rehearsed. A look not of shock, but of someone braced for confirmation. Dora had worked in the vicarage for 6 years and knew more about the private correspondence of the village than any man or woman alive. Not maliciously, of course. But secret keeping, Miss Marple had often said, was not about silence. It was about timing. She fetched her coat and left quietly through the side door, walking the narrow path between hedgerows until she reached the churchyard. The autumn air carried the scent of damp moss and distant wood smoke. Behind the low stone wall, Dora Wills was kneeling beside the flower beds, her thin fingers shaking as she trimmed dead marigolds. Miss Marple's footsteps were nearly silent on the gravel. "My dear," she said gently, "you'll catch your death out here." Dora looked up, startled, a flush creeping into her cheeks. "Oh, Miss Marple, I just needed something to do. Something with my hands." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, seating herself on the wooden bench a few feet away. It's odd how death makes one crave movement, as if the body wants to outrun what the mind must sit with. Dora looked down again, her mouth trembling. "You knew Mr. Weatherby better than most, didn't you?" Miss Marple continued. "He visited often." Dora hesitated. He had business with the church. Documents, you know, old land grants and such." "I understand," Miss Marple said. "He was helping the Reverend Clemens with the lease on the glebe field. But he also asked after the church archives last week, didn't he?" Dora's eyes widened. "How did you—" "I overheard a remark he made to Mr. Latimer at the library. Something about old registers and lost marriages. Curious thing to say." Dora pressed her lips together. Her hands were now folded in her lap, soil still clinging to her gloves. "He said he'd found something that changed the way people would see one another here." "And did you believe him?" After a long silence, Dora nodded. "Yes. Martin always knew how to find weak spots. He had a talent for pressing." Miss Marple smiled softly. "So I've been told." Dora looked around quickly, as if someone might be listening. "He threatened me once. Quietly. Said if I didn't help him with a certain document, he'd mention something about my sister's time in Cheltenham." Miss Marple's brow lifted. "Ah, the unfortunate misunderstanding about the theater money." Dora's face crumpled. It wasn't theft. It was confusion. But the sort of confusion people don't forgive. "And so you gave him what he wanted?" "I did. A copy of the vestry ledger. The original is still locked in the archives." "And do you know what he hoped to find?" "No," Dora whispered. "Only that it involved someone's inheritance." Miss Marple rose then, placing a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder. "You've been brave. I expect it's not easy carrying so many things in silence." Dora looked up, eyes rimmed with unshed tears. "He was going to ruin someone, Miss Marple." "I don't know." "Who? But someone." Miss Marple nodded. "Let's hope, then, that the truth ruined him first." By the next morning, the village had found its rhythm again, or at least an approximation of it. Mrs. Draper had resumed her gossiping with a vengeance, cloaking it in the solemn tone of community updates. The Bloxham sisters had not been seen at morning prayers, and Reverend Clemens, looking more pallid than usual, muttered his sermon with an urgency that made even the devout feel unworthy. At the station, Graves sat reviewing statements. The scarf, imported, Italian, flamboyant, had no fingerprints. The knot had been pulled from behind, suggesting surprise rather than struggle. There were no signs of defensive wounds, no broken fingernails, no hair or skin beneath Weatherby's. In short, someone had known how to kill him without mess. That narrowed it. What puzzled Graves, though, was the positioning. Why the Hawthorne bench? Why in the open on fête day when half the village was within 50 yards? Either the killer was reckless or calculating. He was still pondering that when Miss Marple entered, a small, neat figure who needed no announcement. "I've brought you something," she said mildly, "though I don't suppose you'll think much of it." Graves blinked. "What is it?" "An old program," she replied, handing over a folded leaflet. "From the Cheltenham Players Guild, 1939, a rather forgettable production of The Man Outside, but I thought you might find page 4 interesting." He opened it, eyes scanning the names. "What am I looking for?" "Dora Wills. Stage name Dora Lane. And there, Martin Weatherby, listed as assistant producer." Graves looked up sharply. They knew each other. "More than knew," said Miss Marple, seating herself calmly. "They were engaged for a season. It ended badly. There was talk of betrayal, romantic and financial." Why didn't she mention this? "Because Dora has spent years burying that past," Miss Marple said. "But Martin remembered, and I think he meant to use it. Not out of revenge, you understand, but out of utility. He needed leverage for whatever it was he had found in the church records." Graves tapped the paper. "And you think this has something to do with the inheritance you mentioned?" "I do," Miss Marple said. Martin Weatherby didn't believe in coincidence. If he found a record that exposed an old mistake, perhaps an illegitimate child wrongly denied a claim or a marriage annulled without record, he'd find a way to use it. And that scarf was meant to humiliate. It wasn't just about killing. It was about posing the body. Message over murder. Exactly. Graves leaned back. "So we look into the archives. The ledgers. We find the name he was going to reveal." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "I rather think the murderer already knows what name that is." "Which means," Graves said grimly, "they're 2 steps ahead." Miss Marple rose. "Perhaps, but they also made one mistake." Graves glanced up. "Which was?" She looked at him gently, her tone almost grandmotherly. "They thought no one would recognize the scarf." Detective Inspector Graves stood by the window of his temporary office in the vicarage, the Cheltenham program still resting on the desk behind him. Outside, the village appeared to resume its quiet rhythm. Children cycling past the bakery, a farmer leading a pair of stubborn goats up the lane, and Mrs. Penrose gesturing wildly with a folded umbrella in one hand and a disapproving look in the other. But beneath that rural choreography was a rising tension, subtle and persistent, like a violin string tuned too tightly. He turned as Sergeant Wilton entered, carrying a leather-bound book with gloved hands. "The vestry ledger, sir, from the archives. Took some time to locate. It was wedged behind the baptism registers." Graves opened it carefully. The script was precise, Dates and names lined like soldiers on parade. Wilton hovered, nervous. "Do we know what Weatherby was looking for?" Wilton asked. "Something hidden in plain sight," Graves murmured. "A clerical record with consequences. He believed it would expose someone's secret, inheritance, legitimacy, perhaps an annulled marriage. Something with legal weight." Wilton blinked. "Do you think he was blackmailing someone, sir?" Graves didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tapped the edge of the page, pausing at an entry dated July 14th, 1939. The name recorded was Vivian March, married to one Thomas Bloxham of Lillingham Street. Giles. Witnesses: C. Draper and R. Weatherby. "Bloxham," Graves said slowly. "That name rings clear enough." Wilton frowned. "That would be Margaret Bloxham's father, but Vivian March, I don't recall hearing about her." Graves leaned back. "Nor do I, which is precisely the point." At that same moment, across the village green, Cynthia Bloxham sat rigid in the parlor she shared with her sister. The curtains were drawn. Margaret insisted on privacy when there was speculation in the air, and the stale scent of lavender polish clung to every surface. Margaret stood at the fireplace, arms crossed. "He's asking questions," she said. "Graves, and not about the fate." Cynthia folded her hands tightly in her lap. "He'll want to know everything, and soon. I saw Dora Wills speaking to Miss Marple near the church yesterday." Margaret gave a dry laugh. "Then it's over. Once Miss Marple takes an interest, it's like a wind through dry grass. She won't stop." Cynthia closed her eyes. "We should have destroyed it." "Don't be absurd. We couldn't have touched the archives without drawing attention. Weatherby did. And now he's dead." "I didn't want this," Cynthia whispered. Margaret turned, eyes cold. "You think I did? But what choice did we have? Let him expose our mother's marriage and make us into a laughingstock." Cynthia shivered. It wasn't about laughter. He wanted leverage, and he got it. Margaret sat down opposite her, voice lower now. "Then we keep our stories aligned. We didn't know. We've always been the daughters of Thomas Bloxham and Alice Redley. Nothing else. Nothing earlier. Do you understand?" Cynthia hesitated, then gave a slight nod. At the edge of the village, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Draper. The sitting room smelled faintly of beeswax and sugared almonds, and the lace doilies on every available surface gave the impression that the furniture was being modest. "I'm sorry to intrude," Miss Marple said with her usual gentleness, "but I wondered if you remembered the marriage of a young woman named Vivian March, around 1939, in this very parish." Mrs. Draper, who prided herself on two things, her almond shortbread and her memory, pursed her lips. "Vivian March. Goodness, that's a name I haven't heard in decades. Pretty girl, quick eyes. Dressed like she knew Paris fashions, though I believe she worked at the grocer's on Church Lane. And she married Thomas Bloxham." "Yes," Mrs. Draper said after a pause. "Briefly. Very briefly. It didn't last more than a year. Scandalous, really, for those days." "What happened?" Mrs. Draper leaned forward as if the walls might lean in too. "She left. Just gone. No word. No forwarding address. He remarried a few years later to Alice Redley, and everyone decided not to ask too many questions. After all, the war was starting. People had more pressing worries." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Would you happen to recall if a child was born of that first marriage?" Mrs. Draper blinked, her cup pausing mid-air. "There were rumors. Nothing confirmed. Some said she went north. Others said the child was taken in by relatives and never spoke of again. Do you suppose either Cynthia or Margaret Bloxham know of this first marriage?" "I shouldn't think so," said Mrs. Draper, lowering her voice. "Alice wouldn't have tolerated it. She was very proud, and Margaret is her mother's daughter." Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. "Yes, but Martin Weatherby knew. Mrs. Draper's fingers tightened slightly around the teacup. Oh. Back at the vicarage, Graves laid out the connections on paper. Vivian March, the missing first wife. A child possibly born in secret. Thomas Bloxham's second family now grown and established. And Weatherby, solicitor, opportunist, perhaps blackmailer, uncovering it all through his access to church records. He turned the paper over, writing one word in the center. Motive. There were two at least, one legal, inheritance, claim to property, name, and one emotional, shame, exposure, the social ruin of respectable women. He called Wilton in. We'll need to speak to the Bloxham sisters. Carefully, separately. Wilton nodded, grim. Should we bring them in? Number, they're not suspects. Not yet. The door opened and the vicar entered, hat in hand, looking troubled. I hate to add more confusion, he said, but something strange has come to light. One of the village boys, Toby Merritt, was playing near the back of the parish garden yesterday afternoon. He claims he saw someone throw something into the compost heap. Graves straightened. And we checked. There was a small leather purse buried beneath the leaves. Inside was a monogrammed handkerchief. S.M. Cynthia Margaret Bloxham. The inspector stood, already reaching for his coat. Send word. Ask her to come in quietly. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage moments later, not by invitation, but by instinct, her timing once again impeccable. She listened as Graves relayed the discovery. I imagine she'll deny it, he said, or claim the handkerchief was stolen. Miss Marple nodded, eyes far away. Perhaps. But people don't dispose of things so carelessly unless they're panicked, and panic is rarely the act of the guilty. You think she's protecting someone? I think, Miss Marple said softly, we're very near the truth. And it's not just about who killed Martin Weatherby. It's about who stood to lose who they were if he had lived. Graves stared at her. Do you mean Cynthia isn't? I mean, she said gently, that family trees grow in strange directions, and sometimes it's the branches we don't acknowledge that cause the most rot. Cynthia Bloxham arrived at the vicarage in a charcoal coat too warm for the day, her hands tucked deep in the pockets, her lips pressed into a fine, fixed line. She carried herself with the careful poise of a woman rehearsing each step, each glance. There was no outward sign of nerves, no trembling hand or broken voice, but Graves had seen enough interrogations to recognize the stiffness that spoke of effort, the kind that frays the longer it is asked to hold. He received her in the sitting room, alone, having dismissed Sergeant Wilton with a nod. Miss Marple had retired quietly to the churchyard garden, knitting in her lap, though Graves doubted she was concentrating on the stitches. Miss Bloxham, he began, gesturing toward the seat opposite. Thank you for coming. I know this must be unpleasant. I'm sure you wouldn't ask unless it was necessary, she replied evenly, removing her gloves one finger at a time. Graves nodded. We found something, a personal item, a handkerchief, in the compost heap behind the vicarage, monogrammed with your initials. Her expression did not change. Then someone stole it, or borrowed it. I've had several handkerchiefs go missing at various gatherings. We found it wrapped around a small piece of paper, he continued. That paper had a single sentence, written in fountain pen ink. You know what I found. Cynthia's lashes flickered just once. She sat back, folding her gloves in her lap. That could mean anything. Graves leaned forward slightly. Miss Bloxham, Martin Weatherby had recently uncovered a record. A marriage from 1939 between your father, Thomas Bloxham, and a woman named Vivian March. This marriage predates his to your mother. She said nothing. There's a strong possibility that this marriage produced a child who might still be alive. Still, Cynthia did not speak. If that child exists, their legal status could call into question inheritance rights, even identity. Martin Weatherby was a solicitor. If he knew, if he planned to reveal it, it would affect your family deeply. At last, she drew in a breath, eyes fixed on a spot over Graves' shoulder. He showed me the ledger. At the fete, he pulled me aside, said he had something I ought to see. He made it sound trivial at first, a joke almost. Then he showed me the name, Vivian March, my father's name, the witnesses. And then he said it. It changes things, doesn't it? Graves remained still. And what did you say? I asked if it was real. He said it was, that there was a birth record too, somewhere else, not in the archives. But he wouldn't show it to me. Did you believe him? Yes, Cynthia whispered, because he smiled when I didn't answer, that horrible little smile he always used when he knew he'd cut a nerve. Did you tell your sister? Cynthia shook her head. Number I didn't know what she'd do? Margaret. She believes in control. She spent her whole life preserving the family's name. This, she stopped herself. This would have unstitched everything. Graves watched her for a moment longer. So you panicked. You took the handkerchief, wrapped the note, and threw it away. Her voice was brittle now. Yes, I didn't kill him, Inspector. I swear it. I believe you, Graves said, standing slowly. But someone did. Cynthia's composure finally cracked then. Just enough. If you find the birth record, will that person have a claim? Graves' voice was gentler than he expected. Possibly, but that isn't my concern right now. The law cares less about past mistakes than present murder. When she left, she did not look back. Outside, Miss Marple set down her knitting as the door closed. She rose slowly, as if stretching more than standing, and wandered in through the garden gate just as Graves returned to the front hall. She didn't do it, he said without prompting. No, Miss Marple agreed. Not the right temperament for strangulation. Cynthia is delicate. She might lash out verbally or suffer in silence, but she would never risk blood on her hands. Then who? Miss Marple looked up, blue eyes sharp. Someone who knew Martin wouldn't stop. Someone who feared what else he might reveal. Not only about the Bloxhams, but perhaps about others. Graves crossed his arms. You think there's more than one secret. In a village like this, she smiled faintly. It would be unusual if there weren't. That evening, a curious hush fell over Lillingham Street. Giles, as dusk gathered at the edges of the fields. Curtains were drawn early. Conversations drifted toward the nature of identity. The way names could change lives. The way truths, once buried, might upend decades of harmony. Dora Wills stood in her modest kitchen, rinsing teacups. She paused at the sound of footsteps outside, glancing out through the net curtain. A figure moved past, tall, fast, coat collar turned up, and then was gone. She turned quickly, heart racing, and reached for the drawer where she kept the old envelope. Inside it was the letter Martin had written her before his death, the one she hadn't dared read until that morning. It was brief, unusually so for Martin, and typed. A single line. I found the girl. She lives here. It changes everything. Dora folded the letter again with trembling fingers and placed it back in the envelope, sealing it with a paperclip. She stared at it for a long time, then turned to retrieve her coat. She would take it to Miss Marple. But outside, the wind had picked up, and across the road, a figure paused near the gate of the Bloxham house. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was already writing her own list. It had 3 names on it: Dora Wills, Margaret Bloxham, and an unnamed 4th. The person Weatherby had found. The girl. She had no doubt that Martin had discovered the child of Vivian March. The question was not only who she was, but whether she knew it. And if she didn't, someone else did. Someone willing to kill to keep her from learning. The scarf. It had been flamboyant, yes, but theatrical too. And Miss Marple remembered something then, something small and strange. At last year's village performance, a local production of Much Ado About Nothing held in the town hall, the costume mistress had been Dora Wills, and she had sourced scarves for the male cast from the parish attic and a donation box at the vicarage. One of them had worn a red hummingbird scarf, a prop meant for flair, forgotten afterward, and perhaps retrieved later by someone who knew exactly how to use it. Miss Marple stood and moved toward the bookshelf, withdrawing a copy of the program from last year's fete. There, tucked inside its pages, was the cast list. Her finger stopped on a name. She smiled, not with satisfaction, but with the deep, sad understanding that always accompanied the truth, because she knew then who the girl was, and she knew who had killed Martin Weatherby to keep her from ever finding out. Miss Marple sat in the soft glow of her parlor lamp, the program from last year's village production open in her lap. Her fingers rested lightly on the name that confirmed her suspicion: Elaine Penrose, messenger to Don Pedro. A minor role, hardly noticed in the reviews that followed. But it wasn't the part that mattered. It was the cast listing next to it, the detail most people would overlook. Costumes provided by D. Wills and E. Penrose. Elaine had been Dora's assistant for that production. Not a formal role, no official title, but enough to give her access to the parish costume collection. Enough to know where the hummingbird scarf had come from. And now, enough to make her very, very interesting. It was just past 9 when Miss Marple wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and set out, quietly, toward the Penrose house. The moon was sharp above the hedgerows, and the night air carried the scent of late roses and wood smoke. At this hour, the village whispered instead of spoke. The Penrose home was modest. 2 stories, ivy along the side, a low white gate with a squeak that no one ever bothered to oil. Miss Marple let herself in gently and knocked with the softness of someone who already knows she will be heard. Elaine answered, surprised and cautious, her lavender-tinted hair tied back, her eyes rimmed red. "Miss Marple," she said, uncertain. "Is everything—" "I wonder if I might come in, dear," said Miss Marple gently. "Just for a few moments." Elaine hesitated only a breath before stepping aside. The sitting room was dimly lit, scattered with paintbrushes, unfinished sketches, and a mug of chamomile tea growing cool on the windowsill. A sketch pad lay open on the table, revealing a watercolor in progress. A hawthorn tree, delicately rendered, but with shadows in the foliage that felt almost unnatural. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it. "That's very good. Your sense of light has improved." Elaine flushed faintly. "It's something to keep my hands busy." Miss Marple sat. There are times when keeping the hands busy is the only way to stop the mind from tumbling. Elaine's shoulders tensed just slightly. "My dear," Miss Marple said, voice soft, "I think it's time we talk plainly. Not about what you've done, but what you know." Elaine looked up, startled. "I haven't—" "No," Miss Marple interrupted, still kindly. "I don't believe you've hurt anyone. But I do believe you've been keeping something very important. Something Martin Weatherby may have discovered. Something he might have threatened to reveal." Elaine stood, restless. "Why are you here?" "Because I think you're the girl." Elaine's breath caught. Miss Marple continued, voice unchanging. "The girl born to Vivian March and Thomas Bloxham. Your mother raised you as her own, or perhaps she was your aunt. I'm not sure yet, but someone protected you, gave you a different name, and no one ever told you the truth. Not until recently." Elaine sat slowly, pale now. "Martin found the record," Miss Marple went on. "He knew, and he wanted something. In return, cooperation, leverage, admiration. It doesn't matter. but he told the wrong person. Elaine looked down at her lap, her voice barely audible. It was Dora. "I thought so," Miss Marple said gently. "She found the letter from Martin. He'd written to me, but I was away for the day, painting at the river. She must have seen the envelope and opened it. She always worried for me, treated me like glass. When I came home, she was sitting at the kitchen table, white as a ghost. She didn't tell me what it said, only that I should forget about Martin and never speak to him again." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you?" Elaine shook her head. "Of course not. I went to him the next morning. I had to know. He told me the truth, that my mother had once been married to Thomas Bloxham, that she'd been sent away after the war. She died before I could remember her properly. Dora took me in." "Did he say why he'd brought this to you now?" Elaine hesitated. "He said it could mean a new life, that I could claim my name, my place, that I didn't have to be someone's charity." Miss Marple's face was unreadable. "And how did that make you feel?" "I didn't know," Elaine whispered. "Angry, confused, hopeful even, and frightened. I thought maybe I could be someone." "Did you tell Dora?" "I tried, but she was so frightened. She kept saying that truth destroys people, that names don't change hearts, that I was safer never knowing." Miss Marple reached over and placed a hand over Elaine's. "And then he died." Elaine nodded once. "I want to be very clear, dear. Did you speak to him again after that meeting?" "No," Elaine said. "He told me he would contact me after the fete, but he never did." Outside, the wind rattled softly through the ivy. Miss Marple stood. "Dora thought she was protecting you," she said quietly. "But fear, you know, makes people dangerous, especially when they believe they're preserving love." Elaine's voice was hollow. "Do you think she killed him?" "I think," Miss Marple said with quiet certainty, "that she confronted him. Likely at the fete, in the crowd where no one would notice. I think she asked him to stop, to spare you, perhaps. And I think he refused. Perhaps he laughed." Elaine closed her eyes. "And I think," Miss Marple finished, "she knew about the scarf because you'd handled it. Used it during the performance. She would have known where to find it, how to make it seem like a theatrical statement, a final irony. But most of all, she knew it would frighten you into silence." Elaine's breath came shallowly. "She did it for me." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "but murder is never truly for someone else. It's always, in the end, for the self, for the fear that cannot be borne." Miss Marple left quietly, without asking for thanks or promises, and walked back through the narrow village streets, past shuttered windows and darkened porches. The air smelled of coming rain. By the time she returned to her cottage, she found a note slipped beneath her door. It was written in neat, steady hand. Dora's. "Come to the vestry. I need to talk before they come." She folded the paper, set down her shawl, and made her way toward the church. The truth was waiting, and at last it was ready to be spoken aloud. The vestry door creaked softly on its hinges as Miss Marple stepped inside. The church was quiet, filled with the hollow hush of stone walls absorbing echoes. Only a single lamp glowed in the corner, its weak light casting long, uneasy shadows across the wooden floor. Dora Wills stood near the window, her back to the door, clutching a folded piece of paper in her hands as though it were all that kept her upright. Miss Marple closed the door behind her gently. She said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch, to settle. Dora turned slowly, and in the lamplight her face looked older, worn through in places not visible the day before. She held the paper out as if offering it to a judge. "It's the original," she said hoarsely. "The birth record. Elaine's. I took it from the file Martin brought with him that day. I'd meant to burn it, but I couldn't." Miss Marple stepped forward and took it without ceremony. Her eyes scanned the contents, confirming what she already knew. The child born to Vivian March and Thomas Bloxham, unnamed at birth, later listed as placed with a cousin in Somerset. 1. Dora Lane. The certificate had been folded and refolded so many times the creases were soft as silk. Dora sat heavily in the nearest chair. I told myself I was protecting her, that if I destroyed the record, Martin would have nothing, that he'd lose interest and leave her alone. But he didn't. He came to me after the fate opened, just by the back gate. He was smug. He said he'd already told her, and that there were others who might be very interested in that information too. Perhaps a certain solicitor's office in Bath. He made it sound like a kindness. He always made cruelty sound like charity. Miss Marple said nothing, only folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her bag. I begged him, Dora continued. I told him she didn't want anything, that she wouldn't claim a name or a house or money. He laughed, said that wasn't the point, that the knowledge itself was valuable. He wanted leverage. Not money, not exactly. Influence, power. To be the man people turned to when they needed secrets managed. And when he wouldn't stop, Miss Marple said softly, "You panicked." Dora pressed her hands to her face, then dropped them into her lap. I didn't mean to. I only followed him back toward the marquee. I thought if I threatened him, told him I'd tell Graves everything, he'd back off. But he didn't. He said no one would believe me, that I'd look like a bitter woman protecting a girl who didn't know her place. Her voice cracked, the words coming faster. And then I saw the scarf, lying on the edge of the costuming bench from last year's fete. It must have been pulled from the storage box for something or forgotten. I don't even remember picking it up, only that I wanted him to stop talking. I wanted it to end. I tied it around his neck, thinking it would frighten him. But I pulled, and then he just went still. I let go, but it was already done. Miss Marple sat across from her, her voice very calm. "And you posed him, on the bench beneath the hawthorn?" Dora nodded, barely. I thought if it looked deliberate, theatrical, they'd think it was someone trying to make a point, someone with a history, a vendetta. And I thought if Elaine never knew the full truth, she'd be safe. She already knew, Miss Marple said gently. Dora's eyes closed. Then it was all for nothing. No, Miss Marple said. It was all for fear. And fear is never nothing. But it isn't love either. A long silence followed. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees and a branch tapped gently against the stained glass window above. Miss Marple stood. "I'll speak to Inspector Graves. It should come from me." Dora didn't move. "Will it matter that I didn't plan it?" "It will matter," Miss Marple said, "that you tell the truth now." She turned toward the door, but paused before she opened it. "I once knew a woman," she said softly, "who spent her entire life guarding the truth about her sister's child. It made her careful, vigilant. It also made her cruel, without ever meaning to be. That's what secrets do when they stay too long in the dark. They start to grow teeth." Dora looked down at her lap, at her hands, at nothing. "She's a good girl, Miss Marple. Elaine. Kind. She paints because she sees beauty. Not everyone does." "She'll still see it," Miss Marple replied, "even when the truth comes." Outside, the rain had finally started. Not hard, but steady. Soft drops tapping across the flagstones like the ticking of a clock. Miss Marple walked slowly through the churchyard, her footsteps almost inaudible. The birth record was still in her bag, folded now beside a second paper she had tucked away years ago. A lesson from an old case where a name hidden on a church register had nearly destroyed 3 families. In the end, it had not been the truth that undid them, but the lies built to contain it. She reached the vicarage just as Graves was preparing to leave. He looked up, surprised by her sudden appearance, but she raised a hand before he could speak. "She's ready," Miss Marple said. "Dora Wills. She'll tell you everything." Graves' brow darkened. "So it was her." "It was," Miss Marple confirmed, "but not out of malice, only panic and love, the dangerous sort." Graves exhaled slowly and reached for his coat. "I'll go now. Better before dawn. And the girl?" "She was the motive," Miss Marple said. "Not the means." He paused at the door. "You always see the fracture before the break." "Only because I spend more time watching how people hide their hurts than how they wear their heads." He gave a wry nod and stepped into the rain. By the time the sun rose, Dora Wills had given her statement. There were no dramatics, no wailing confession, only the plain recounting of fear, impulse, and the dreadful clarity that comes in the seconds after a fatal mistake. Graves listened without interruption, and when she was finished, he thanked her, not warmly, but with something close to dignity. Elaine was not told until the following day. Miss Marple chose her words carefully, omitting none of the truth but softening the edges where they might cut too deep. The girl wept. Not from grief, but from the terrible weight of understanding how much love can cost. "I don't want a name," she said quietly. "Or money, or papers. Just to paint. To live without anyone else deciding what I am." Miss Marple took her hand. "Then that, my dear, is what you must do." The village, for its part, retreated into its usual rhythm with remarkable speed. Deaths, even those caused by scandal and strangulation, faded in time beneath the routine of post and bread and small concerns. Mrs. Draper found a new cause for outrage when the council proposed trimming the hedges by the war memorial, and Cynthia Bloxham took a holiday in Eastbourne for her nerves. Only Miss Marple remained unchanged, quietly watching the world with her soft eyes and sharp mind, knitting folded neatly on her lap, tea cooling by the window, and a mind that missed nothing. Least of all, the human need to be seen, and the greater, more dangerous need to remain hidden. The funeral of Martin Weatherby was held on a drizzling Tuesday, the sort of weather that made black wool shine and umbrellas bloom like dark lilies along the church path. The pews were modestly filled, respectable, but not overflowing, which in Miss Marple's estimation was fitting. Weatherby had known many, liked few, and been truly liked by fewer. His clients came out of obligation, his acquaintances came out of curiosity, and a few, like Dora Wills, attended in silence, shadowed with remorse. Elaine sat at the rear, hat low over her face, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles stood out sharp against her gloves. Miss Marple sat beside her, a calm presence. Not a chaperone, not a guardian, merely someone who understood that being quietly seen can be a kind of anchor. Inspector Graves stood near the nave, speaking quietly with the vicar before the service began. There was no formal announcement of Dora Wills's involvement in the death. No newspaper headline. Graves had decided, with Miss Marple's quiet persuasion, to proceed with discretion. Dora had confessed. There would be a quiet inquest. No public trial. The Crown Prosecution Service had, in its way, understood. An impulsive act, not premeditated, not repeated. A decision born of fear, not design. And so the village breathed again, not quite freely, but with enough space between heartbeats to return to its routines. After the service, people scattered as they always did, some into the graveyard, others to the tea tent hastily resurrected behind the church, as if a cup of Darjeeling could steep away the memory of a strangled solicitor. Cynthia and Margaret Bloxham left quickly, their shoulders tight, lips pressed together in a line of familial solidarity that neither warmth nor curiosity could penetrate. Miss Marple lingered by the yew tree, observing the subtle currents of conversation. Who spoke to whom, who avoided whose eyes, and where the silences nestled like sleeping dogs. It was, in its way, more revealing than any confession. Graves joined her after a while, hands in his coat pockets. "You were right," he said simply. "I often am," Miss Marple replied, smiling without smugness. "But it's not a matter of pride, only observation." Graves nodded toward Elaine. "What will she do?" "Paint," Miss Marple said. "She may leave for a while, or stay and fade into the hedgerows, depending on how the village reshapes itself around her. But she won't ask for anything. That's the danger, Inspector. People who ask for nothing are often the ones most easily taken from." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Do you believe Dora knew what she was doing? That it would kill him?" Miss Marple turned her eyes toward the gravestone Weatherby's coffin had just passed. The name upon it was unfamiliar. So many lives and names faded that way, carved once, remembered by none. "I believe," she said, "that she knew only what it would mean if he lived." The silence settled again, soft and steady like the rain. That evening, with the village back beneath its evening hush and the teacups washed and shelved, Miss Marple sat once more in her parlor. The window was open just a little, enough to let the scent of damp grass drift in, and the room smelled of lemon polish and wool. The kettle murmured on the stove. She was rereading Dora's letter, not from necessity but reflection. It was careful, restrained. The kind of letter written by someone who had long lived in the margins of her own story. No pleas, no excuses, only clarity. And a line that Miss Marple had read 5 times now, underlined in blue pencil. "I spent my whole life trying to protect her from where she came from. I never thought I'd need to protect her from where she was going. That, in the end, was the heart of it. Not revenge, not hatred. Simply the oldest story in the world, a woman trying to rewrite the world around a child she loved. But it had been a child born of scandal, hidden from a father who never acknowledged her, raised by a cousin, too afraid to tell the truth. And when that truth rose from the dead in the form of Martin Weatherby, dressed in polished shoes and armed with parish ledgers and a solicitor's eye for advantage, it had become a weapon." Miss Marple put the letter away and went to pour her tea. She did not believe in evil, not precisely. She believed in weakness and in vanity and in fear. She believed in the way small choices accumulated like dust, unnoticed until the weight of them collapsed something vital. And most of all, she believed in what people refused to see in themselves. There was a knock at the door. Not urgent, but firm. It was Margaret Bloxham. Miss Marple opened the door with a nod, stepping aside without needing to be asked. Margaret stood in the center of the room as if she'd never been in a home where books leaned naturally and armchairs wore their age proudly. Her coat was damp at the hem. "I've come to ask if it's true," she said. Miss Marple gestured for her to sit. She did not. "That depends," said Miss Marple gently, "on what you mean by true." "That girl," Margaret said, her voice low. "Elaine. She's not just some painter's niece, is she?" Miss Marple looked at her for a long moment. "She's the daughter of Vivian March. And of your father." Margaret's expression didn't change. Not exactly, but something in her gaze flattened. "So it's true." "Yes." "And Mother knew?" "Number, your mother never knew. Vivian disappeared before she could tell her. The marriage was never annulled. Your parents married regardless, believing the silence was safe." Margaret turned away, staring at the small fire Miss Marple had lit earlier. "I suppose you think I'm here to deny her something, to contest it, to sneer." "I think you're here," said Miss Marple calmly, "because you've always needed to be the person who decides what is remembered and what is forgotten." That struck as she intended it to. Margaret stiffened, then exhaled. It was not a sigh of defeat. It was the sound of a structure shifting slightly to bear weight. "Cynthia doesn't know," she said at last. "Not fully. I never told her about the ledger, about what Weatherby found. I wanted to keep her clean. Truth does not soil people, Miss Marple said. Only the lies we weave to keep it hidden. Margaret's hands were clenched now. I won't contest anything. The house, the name, she can have it if she wants it, but she shouldn't expect welcome. She doesn't, said Miss Marple. She doesn't want your name, Margaret. She wants her own. Margaret nodded once and left. The fire crackled on, the logs shifting into a brighter orange as if exhaling something long held back. Later that night, Elaine walked the length of the green with a canvas tucked under her arm. She left it on Miss Marple's doorstep with a note folded behind the frame. Miss Marple found it the next morning, just after breakfast, and unwrapped it with slow care. It was the hawthorn tree, the one by the bench where Weatherby had died. But it was not the tree alone. It was the bench too, empty, with one scarf draped over the armrest. The scarf was barely visible, just a suggestion of red against wood grain. But the shadows beneath the tree were deep, and in them, something almost human. Not a figure, not clearly, but a presence. The note was only one sentence. Thank you for seeing me clearly and not flinching. Miss Marple smiled, folded the note, and added it to her drawer. She had, as ever, seen the whole of it from the beginning. Not from the scarf, not from the church, but from the way Dora had looked at the girl when the body was found. Not frightened, not grief-stricken, but terrified. Terrified of what the girl might lose if the past returned. But the past always returns. And so do the people who've been waiting their whole lives for someone to finally say, I see you. The following days passed with the kind of hush that Lillingham Street, Giles was particularly good at, a self-imposed quiet that wrapped itself around each house like a shawl. There was no more talk in the post office queue, no nods at the greengrocer's stall, no speculative glances exchanged at the corner of the green. The village wasn't avoiding the scandal. It was digesting it, slowly, cautiously, the way one might chew a bitter seed found in a sweet fruit. Miss Marple, for her part, received no visitors. There was no need. The ones who mattered had already come and spoken, or left things unspoken but understood. Graves had concluded his inquiries, quietly filing his reports, satisfied that no further justice was needed beyond what had already passed in shadow. Dora Wills had resigned from the vicar's office and was, by all accounts, preparing to go and live with a cousin in Somerset. Not as punishment, but as retreat, as surrender. And as for Elaine, she remained, though not loudly. It was just before dusk on a Thursday when Miss Marple saw her again, standing on the edge of the green in a worn mackintosh, sketchbook in hand, head bowed slightly against the breeze. She was drawing the vicarage this time, its steep roof and crooked chimneys softened with watercolor. Miss Marple watched from her parlor window without moving. She knew better than to interrupt someone engaged in the act of seeing. Elaine was not painting to remember. She was painting to witness, and that, Miss Marple thought, was how one began again. It was the following morning when the final piece arrived, not a person, but a letter. It was addressed in the thin, fussy handwriting of Reverend Clemens, postmarked 2 days earlier, and delivered alongside the village newsletter and an advertisement for a new brand of digestive biscuits. Miss Marple slit it open with her letter knife and unfolded the contents, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read. Dear Miss Marple, it may not be my place, but I thought you ought to know. I've been sorting the church records for the incoming curate, and among them I found a second letter tucked behind the marriage register. It appears to have been written by Vivian March to the vicar of the time, sometime after she left the village. The envelope was never opened. I suppose it was mislaid. The handwriting is hers. You can verify. If you think the recipient deserves to see it, I will leave that in your care. With respect, Clemens. There was a second envelope enclosed, yellowed at the corners, sealed but brittle with age. Miss Marple held it for a moment before opening it, careful not to tear the thin parchment. The writing inside was slanted, elegant, unmistakably Vivian's. Miss Marple had only ever seen it once before, long ago, in a school prize book still shelved in the church lending library. But memory, she had found, had a way of preserving what mattered. "My dear Reverend, I ask only this. If my daughter ever returns to Lillingham, if she ever walks the green or sits beneath the hawthorn tree, do not let her believe she was abandoned. I left for her sake, not my own. They would never have let her be. I loved Thomas. I never hated Alice. But I knew what they needed to become, and I knew I would ruin it. Let her grow in peace, in decency, without my shadow. But should she ever ask who I was, please, tell her I saw her last in sunlight." She was laughing. She had found a feather in the garden. I told her it was from an angel, and she believed me. That is the child I remember. Vivian March. Miss Marple set the letter down and closed her eyes. She made tea, slowly, letting the kettle hum its lullaby, and when the cup was steeped and cooling on the tray, she placed the letter carefully inside an envelope and addressed it in her own neat hand. Miss Elaine Penrose, Siwuo No. 9, Heatherbank Lane, Lillingham Street. Giles. She didn't send it by post. She walked it there herself just before noon, slipping it into the letterbox and turning without knocking. There were no more conversations to be had, only silence and the weight of a mother's words left waiting too long to be heard. Later that evening, as light thinned across the rooftops and swifts danced low above the chimneys, Elaine read the letter. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She took it to the table, placed it beside her paints, and began a new canvas. It was the garden, not her own, not Dora's, but a memory half recalled, half invented. There were roses, a child's coat, sky blue, tossed across the grass, a feather, almost weightless, resting against the hedge. She painted until dark, and even then she didn't stop. The following morning, a final knock came to Miss Marple's door. It was Cynthia Bloxham. She looked thinner than before, the sharpness in her features drawn in more by anxiety than age. She didn't sit when invited. She clasped her handbag with both hands and stared at the floor before speaking. "Margaret told me," she said at last, "about Vivian, about the girl." Miss Marple nodded once. "I thought I would feel angry," Cynthia said, "but I don't. I feel like someone's turned the light on in a room I'd been sitting in for years without knowing it was dark." Miss Marple waited. "She's my sister," Cynthia said. "Half-sister, but that's a technicality. I remember my father taking walks alone in the evenings. I remember our mother looking at old letters and burning them in the fireplace. We weren't meant to understand, but now I think I always did." She drew in a breath. "I'll speak to her. Elaine, I don't know if she'll want anything to do with me, but I'll try." "That," said Miss Marple, "is all you can do." Cynthia turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Do you think it ever ends? The damage, the way secrets pull everything sideways?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Number, but I think if we stop pretending the damage never happened, we might begin to heal." Cynthia nodded once and slipped out into the morning mist. And so, gradually, the pieces of Lillingham Street. Giles shifted. Not dramatically, not publicly, but subtly, like a door left ajar instead of locked. The green grew quiet again. The vicarage took on its new curate. The tea tent was folded and packed away. But those who remained had changed. Not into strangers, but into people who had seen themselves reflected in others more truthfully than before. Miss Marple returned to her garden, her knitting, her letters from distant cousins and friends in Devon and Harrogate. The mystery had ended. But as with all real things, its ending was not a closing. It was a widening. And in the evening, when the light turned gold across the spines of her books, she thought again of Vivian's letter and of the child who had believed in angels. She believed it too. Still, not always with wings, but always with feathers. It was Sunday morning, and the bells of St. Jude's rang softly over the rooftops of Lillingham Street. Giles, their chimes as familiar and forgiving as the warm scent of bread from the bakery. The village gathered as it always did, not because of obligation or belief necessarily, but because ritual is its own kind of faith. One by one they filed into the cool stone of the church, the murmurs of last week's confessions folded gently into hymnals and polite nods. Elaine entered alone. She wore no hat, only a simple grey coat and a scarf the color of early morning mist. Her hair had been pulled back with care, and her expression, while not guarded, was composed, as if she had spent the night putting each part of herself where it belonged. There was no trace of bitterness, but there was no need for gratitude either. She carried her name now, not as a burden, but as something accepted, like the shape of a tree one never noticed until winter stripped it bare. Miss Marple, seated 2 rows back, observed without intrusion. She had never believed in happy endings. She believed in settled hearts and unburdened sleep. And as Elaine moved to the pew beside Cynthia Bloxham, without hesitation and without any sign of invitation having been extended, Miss Marple thought, yes, that will do. Cynthia glanced sideways once and then again, as though confirming what her heart already knew. And then she shifted slightly, just enough to make room. No words were spoken, but a hand settled between them on the polished wood, close enough to touch. It did not. The service passed in familiar rhythm, and afterward, the villagers mingled in the churchyard, circling each other with a blend of habit and caution. Mrs. Draper muttered to the vicar about the lack of lace on the altar cloths. Young Toby Merritt kicked at a clump of moss with something like contrition, as though the earlier weeks had taught him that mischief might have consequences beyond detention. Inspector Graves appeared briefly, removing his hat in the sun, offering a nod to Miss Marple that conveyed, without flourish, the end of the official matter. And somewhere near the gate, Dora Wills, suitcase in hand, stood waiting. She wore her best coat, 1 button missing. Her eyes sought no one. She had said her goodbyes quietly, through notes left on desks, folded into drawers, handed to the curate with shaking fingers. But she had not seen Elaine, not since that night. And now, as the motor car arranged to take her to the station rumbled softly on the lane, she remained still, uncertain. Elaine stepped forward. The 2 women faced each other in the filtered light beneath the yew trees, the low hum of the congregation thinning behind them. Neither reached out. Neither cried. "You got my painting?" Elaine asked softly. Dora nodded. "It was beautiful. I meant every brush stroke." "I know. I wish you'd told me. I thought I was saving you. You were only delaying me." Dora swallowed. "I never knew how to tell the story without erasing myself from it." Elaine tilted her head. "Then maybe you should have let me write it instead." A pause. Then, very gently, Dora said, "Will you be all right?" "I think I already am." And with that, Elaine stepped forward and kissed Dora once on the cheek. Not farewell, not forgiveness, just something final enough to leave no room for regret. The car door closed softly, and Dora Wills was gone. Miss Marple, from a distance, watched the exchange and allowed herself the smallest sigh. There was, she believed, a kind of grace in things unspoken, in what was allowed to end without being explained. That was how you knew a person had finally stepped beyond the need to be understood. Later that day, as the village returned to itself, hedges trimmed, potatoes bought, windows opened for the first warmth of spring, Miss Marple sat in her parlor writing a letter to her nephew Raymond. It was not her usual kind. Not filled with stories of village trifles or the baking habits of Mrs. Penrose. It was more reflective than that. She described in spare but careful prose what it was like to witness a life nearly undone by the truths withheld from it, and what it was like to see someone step into their name not with triumph, but with quiet certainty. She folded the letter, placed it with the others, and then turned to the window. The green was nearly empty now, the last of the parishioners gone, and across the grass, Elaine stood alone at the hawthorn bench. She held nothing in her hands, no paper, no brush. She looked at the tree not as a place of death, but as a place where the story had demanded to be seen clearly. She stayed a long while, then turned, walking back toward the village with the calmness of someone who had stopped looking over her shoulder. Miss Marple did not wave. Instead, she reached for her knitting, took up the dropped stitch she had noticed earlier in the morning and worked it back into place with the ease of a woman who had learned, long ago, that patterns only looked tangled when you were too close to them. In time, everything could be made whole again. Not unbroken, but whole. The letter from Raymond came a week later, folded crisply in his usual thick parchment, scented faintly of eucalyptus and the city. He was, as always, equal parts doting and dismissive. Aunt Jane, only you would find murder between the raffle tent and the jam stall. But beneath the banter, he asked a question that lingered in her mind, long after the ink had faded. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't seen it? If you hadn't noticed the scarf, the hesitation, the little silence no one else heard? Miss Marple read the line twice before folding the letter away. She did not wonder, because the truth had never arrived in a single dramatic stroke. It had tiptoed in, disguised as Dora's trembling hand trimming marigolds, as Elaine's flushed silence when asked about Weatherby, as a scarf that was too red, too flamboyant, too cruel to be his. And in the end, it had not been the scarf or the body that solved it. It had been the look Dora gave the girl at the scene, a glance so fleeting, so charged, it had betrayed what the murder tried to conceal. Fear not for herself, but for someone else, the kind of fear that is born only of love. From there, the rest had unfolded as it always did when Miss Marple allowed herself to follow human behavior rather than crime scenes. A solicitor with a fondness for leverage, a forgotten marriage and a hidden child born of it. A village that had wrapped its reputation in lace and tradition, unprepared for what might crawl out from beneath its carefully swept carpets. And behind it all, the same thread she always found, no matter where she looked. The quiet ache of people pretending to be less than they are, for the comfort of others. She closed her notebook with finality. The affair of Martin Weatherby's death would be spoken of less and less as time went on. There would be whispers, perhaps, around anniversaries and fates. The scarf would remain somewhere in police evidence or be destroyed. But the true resolution had already taken root. In Cynthia, reaching across years of silence to acknowledge a sister. In Elaine, returning, day after day, to her easel without the weight of doubt. In Margaret, no longer watching every corner of the village like a sentry guarding shame. Miss Marple made her way to the kitchen. It was nearly time for the scones to come out of the oven, and she always prided herself on the timing. Outside, a faint breeze stirred the tulips. Across the lane, Elaine was painting again. This time the post office, dappled with late spring light, its door slightly ajar. Miss Marple poured tea, stirred in a spoonful of honey, and sat back. There would always be crimes, always secrets, always some poor girl who had been told she was less, or worse, too much, for the space she occupied. But as long as she had her eyes and her memory and her deep belief that people betrayed themselves in the smallest ways, Miss Marple would continue to see. Not for the glory, not for the shock, but for the quiet restoration that only truth could bring. She took a sip, let the warmth settle, and somewhere between the stillness and the steam, she smiled. Because the story had ended. Not with a noose or a gavel, but with a name returned to the girl who'd never known it was hers. And that, she thought, was justice enough, 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 was justice enough.